Make my wife a partner, Dad, or leave my company forever. My son's voice thundered across the 20-foot conference table so loudly that even the city noise outside the 42nd floor windows seemed to disappear. Every executive in the room froze. Coffee cups stopped halfway to lips. Pens stopped moving. My daughter-in-law, Emily, leaned back in her chair and smiled as if she had already won. "You heard him, John," she said calmly. "It's time for the next generation to take over." I stared at the son I had raised, the same boy whose bicycle I had taught him to ride on a quiet street outside Chicago 40 years earlier. "Your company?" I asked quietly. David crossed his arms. "That's right. My company." The words hit harder than I expected. Not because they were loud, but because they revealed something I had been refusing to see for years. The room remained silent. Then Emily reached across the polished walnut table and placed her hand on David's arm. "He'll understand eventually," she whispered, just loud enough for everyone to hear. In that moment, surrounded by people who had worked beside me for decades, I felt more alone than I ever had in my life. Before I tell you what happened next, if this story speaks to your heart, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel. And if this story truly resonates with you, leave a comment sharing your city or country and your local time. I always enjoy seeing where people are listening from around the world. My name is John Miller. I am 68 years old, and this was the day that changed everything I thought I knew about my family, my company, and the son I loved. The lesson hidden inside this story surprised even me, so stay with me until the end. And now, let me take you back to where it all began. 3 years before that meeting, I believed my life was finally slowing down. After 4 decades of building Miller Industrial Solutions from a tiny warehouse outside Joliet into a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars, I had started thinking about retirement. My wife, Linda, was 65. We talked about spending more time at our lake cabin in Wisconsin. We talked about fishing, gardening, traveling, normal things, peaceful things. David seemed eager to take more responsibility. At first, I was proud of him. "You built something incredible, Dad," he would tell me. "I just want to help carry it forward." Those words meant everything to me. Looking back now, I realize I wanted to believe them so badly that I ignored the warning signs. The first sign appeared shortly after David married Emily. At family dinners, conversations slowly began changing. Decisions that used to be discussed became announcements. Suggestions became demands. One evening at our home in Naperville, Emily looked around the dinner table and said, "Businesses need modern leadership. Too many founders stay too long." Nobody responded. Linda quietly set down her fork. David laughed and changed the subject, but I noticed something strange. He wasn't disagreeing with her. He was protecting her. A few months later, one of our senior managers retired after 27 years with the company. During the replacement discussion, Emily insisted on recommending one of her friends. "She has an MBA," Emily said. "She's exactly what this company needs." "Experience matters too," I replied. Emily's smile tightened. "Sometimes experience is just another word for old habits." The room became uncomfortable. David looked away. That was the first time I felt the ground shifting beneath my feet. Still, I convinced myself it was nothing. Families have disagreements. Generations see things differently. That's normal. Or so I thought. Then came the board meetings. Slowly, Emily began appearing more often. At first she attended as David's guest. Then she started speaking. Then she started influencing decisions. Soon people were treating her as if she already held authority she had never earned. One afternoon, Linda pulled me aside. "Something doesn't feel right," she said. "What do you mean?" I asked. "They're moving pieces around the board without telling you." I laughed. "David wouldn't do that." Linda looked at me with sadness rather than disagreement. "I hope you're right." For months, I ignored her concerns. I ignored unusual emails. I ignored meetings scheduled without my knowledge. I ignored the growing sense that conversations stopped whenever I entered a room. Until one rainy Tuesday morning when Sophie, my executive assistant, quietly closed my office door and placed a folder on my desk. "Mr. Miller," she said nervously, "I think there's something you need to see." I opened the folder expecting routine paperwork. Instead, I found documents that made my stomach tighten. Draft partnership proposals, internal communications, strategy notes. And at the top of one page was a sentence that changed everything. Emily Miller, recommended future equity partner. But that wasn't the most shocking thing hidden inside the folder. Buried beneath those pages was a document containing a secret neither David nor Emily realized I was about to discover. And when I read the first line, I knew my family had been hiding something far bigger than a partnership request. I sat there staring at the document while rain tapped softly against my office window. The title alone was enough to make my chest feel heavy. Emily Miller, recommended future equity partner. But the pages beneath it told a deeper story, one that did not begin in a boardroom. It began years earlier in my own home. As I looked through those papers, memories came rushing back. David had always been a bright kid. When he was 8 years old, he used to spend Saturday mornings sitting beside me in the garage while I repaired equipment for the company. "One day this will all be yours, right, Dad?" he once asked while holding a flashlight for me. I smiled and wiped grease from my hands. "One day if you earn it." He grinned. "I will." Back then, I believed every word he said. Linda believed in him too. Every birthday, every baseball game, every school event, we were there. When David wanted a new glove at 12, I drove 40 miles to find the exact model he wanted. When he struggled in college, Linda spent countless nights helping him prepare for exams. We never kept score. That is what parents do. They give. They sacrifice. They hope. The first time I noticed something changing was after David met Emily. At first, she seemed charming, smart, ambitious, confident. During family dinners, she always had an opinion about everything. One Thanksgiving evening, we were gathered around our dining table in Naperville. The turkey had barely been served when Emily looked around the room and said, "Families sometimes hold successful people back because they expect loyalty instead of growth." The room became quiet. Linda gently asked, "What do you mean by that?" Emily smiled. "I just think some people stay tied to old ways because they are afraid of change." David laughed awkwardly. "Emily likes challenging people." Everyone moved on, but I noticed something that bothered me. David immediately defended her whenever anyone disagreed. Over time, little things began adding up. At Christmas, Linda spent weeks selecting thoughtful gifts for everyone. Emily barely glanced at hers before setting it aside and focusing on an expensive watch David had purchased for her. During family vacations, decisions increasingly revolved around what Emily wanted. Restaurants, activities, schedules. Nobody complained, but everyone noticed. One summer at our Wisconsin lake cabin, Linda suggested a family photo by the dock. Emily rolled her eyes and whispered to David, thinking nobody could hear, "Why do we always have to do things their way?" David nodded. That hurt Linda more than she admitted. Later that night, she sat beside me on the porch overlooking the water. "Do you think we are losing him?" she asked quietly. I stared across the dark lake. "No, he is just trying to balance family and marriage." But even as I said it, I was not entirely convinced. Then came the company events. David increasingly introduced Emily into discussions that had nothing to do with her role. During one leadership dinner downtown, a senior manager congratulated me on a successful quarter. Before I could answer, Emily jumped in. "The company needs fresh leadership if it wants to survive another decade." The manager looked uncomfortable. David said nothing. Not one word. Looking back now, I realized the warning signs were everywhere. The favoritism was subtle at first. Then it became a pattern. Every disagreement ended with David choosing Emily's side. Every concern raised by Linda was dismissed. Every question I asked was treated as resistance to progress. And as I continued reading the documents Sophie had given me, I discovered evidence that those patterns were not accidental. They were part of a plan that had been developing quietly for much longer than I ever imagined. Then I reached the final page in the folder and saw a date from nearly 18 months earlier, proving this had started long before anyone in my family claimed it had. And suddenly, I realized someone had been hiding the truth from me for a very long time. I sat back in my chair, letting the papers fall gently to the polished wood desk. For the first time in years, I did not react the way I normally would have. I did not yell. I did not argue. I simply observed. David shifted in his seat, sensing something different in me. Emily's confident smile faltered slightly as she noticed my silence. The tension in the room was nearly palpable, but I remained still, measuring every glance, every subtle shift in posture. Michael Thompson, my longtime attorney, raised an eyebrow, waiting for a signal, but I gave none. I allowed a slow smile to form, not one of concession, but of understanding. "John, are you going to say something?" Emily finally asked, her voice tinged with impatience. Not yet, I replied calmly, letting the words hang in the air, giving them room to realize that the dynamic had changed. My mind raced back to years of small betrayals, overlooked preferences, and moments when I had allowed habit to dictate my reactions. That day, I knew that I could no longer follow old patterns. The silence itself became a statement, and I could see the unease spreading among my family and the executives gathered around the table. David's hands, previously clenched in frustration, now rested flat on the table, betraying his uncertainty. Emily's eyes darted toward the city skyline outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, perhaps seeking support from the view she loved so much, but she found none. "Do you really think ignoring us will change anything?" David asked, his voice a mixture of challenge and confusion. I leaned forward, resting both hands on the table, and looked him directly in the eyes. "It is not about ignoring you. It is about understanding what has been hidden from me, what has been overlooked, and what must finally be recognized." Linda, sitting quietly beside me, nodded slightly, her fingers brushing the surface of the table, a silent show of solidarity that strengthened my resolve. Sophie, my executive assistant, stood near the doorway, noting every reaction, a quiet witness to the shift that was taking place. The room, once filled with overconfidence and anticipation of my capitulation, now held its breath. I allowed the weight of my presence and experience to speak, and as I did, subtle nods from longtime colleagues acknowledged the truth that had been obscured for far too long. A document that had seemed merely procedural now became the key to demonstrating foresight and dedication, revealing contributions and strategies that Emily had underestimated. I finally spoke, my voice firm but composed. "There is a record of every decision, every effort, and every outcome that has brought this company to where it is today. And those contributions, long ignored, will be acknowledged." David swallowed, realizing that his habitual dominance was being met with methodical insight rather than emotional reaction. Emily's gaze wavered as the first crack appeared in her certainty. Michael leaned forward, quietly affirming the validity of what I was saying. The executives shifted in their seats, suddenly attentive, understanding that the narrative was no longer controlled by the latest voices, but by decades of proven results and commitment. I could see the change beginning. The imbalanced power that had dictated conversations was starting to tilt, creating space for fairness and recognition that had been absent. Just as I was about to reveal a critical piece of evidence, something that would make David and Emily reconsider every assumption they had made about loyalty and capability, a knock came at the door, soft but deliberate. The moment paused. Every eye turned toward the entrance. I realized that whatever was coming next would change the atmosphere completely, and that this was the instant when the course of the family and the company would pivot dramatically, setting the stage for revelations that none of us were fully prepared to face. I felt a chill as the door opened and Sophie stepped in, holding a second folder, slightly trembling, as if she knew the weight of what she carried. "Mr. Miller, there is more," she said softly. I gestured for her to place it on the table, and as the folder landed with a quiet thud, the room seemed to lean in, drawn to the tension that had suddenly intensified. I opened it slowly, revealing emails, memos, and messages that painted a picture I had only suspected but had not yet fully grasped. They were documents showing deliberate manipulation, carefully orchestrated suggestions planted in the minds of our executives, creating narratives that favored Emily and her perspective at every turn. David had unknowingly echoed some of the instructions, reinforcing them with confidence, believing he was exercising his judgment, while in reality, he was part of a larger deception. I read a message from one of our senior managers to Emily, praising her initiative and recommending strategic moves that subtly undermined my oversight, all under the guise of modernization. Emily's expression faltered for a moment when she noticed my gaze scanning each document with calm intensity. "John, these are just recommendations," she said, attempting to regain composure. I did not reply immediately. I allowed the words to linger, letting the truth of the manipulation sink into the consciousness of everyone present. The executives shifted uneasily in their chairs, aware for the first time that something had been hidden from them. These recommendations influenced decisions beyond their scope. I finally said, my voice steady. They have altered perceptions and priorities throughout the company without acknowledgement of the actual contributors. David's face paled slightly, his habitual certainty beginning to crumble. I thought I was making the right calls, he admitted, his voice quieter than usual. Linda reached over and touched my hand gently, a silent show of support, and I nodded, signaling that this was not merely about corporate maneuvering, but about fairness and integrity long ignored. Sophie handed me another set of documents, this time detailing misreported hours, altered project plans, and strategically leaked information that had created rifts between teams, all tracing back to subtle suggestions orchestrated by Emily. I leaned back and looked around the room. The weight of betrayal hung thick in the air. Everyone had been unknowingly participating in a scheme of omission and embellishment, believing it was a natural evolution of leadership, not realizing they had been manipulated. I cannot believe this, one of the senior managers whispered, shaking his head. Emily's confident smile had vanished, replaced by a flicker of fear as the enormity of her actions and the unintentional consequences became apparent. David looked at me, his eyes wide, struggling to find words, while I remained calm, absorbing the reality that those I had trusted most had become instruments of deception without even knowing it. I took a deep breath, understanding that this moment marked a turning point, that the carefully constructed facade of control and influence was beginning to collapse before everyone's eyes. The final memo in the folder contained an acknowledgement from a high-level executive, confirming that decisions had been intentionally misrepresented and that several key initiatives had been guided under false pretenses. The room was silent, the collective shock palpable, and as I closed the folder slowly, everyone looked to me, uncertain, searching for the next move. The air seemed heavier, filled with the tension of accountability and the impending unraveling of trust, signaling that the very structure of influence within the company and within my own family was on the verge of a dramatic and undeniable collapse. I spent the next several days in a blur of frustration and disbelief, attempting to repair the damage that had been quietly accumulating for months. Every phone call I made to senior managers seemed to be met with hesitation or excuses. I thought we were following Emily's recommendations, one manager admitted nervously during a call from the Oakbrook office. I hung up the receiver, my hands trembling slightly, realizing that the subtle manipulation had taken root deeper than I had imagined. Emails I sent outlining proper procedures, requesting clarification, and offering guidance went unanswered or were redirected with vague replies. "John, everything is proceeding according to plan," read one brief note from David, the casual words disguising the tension and the deliberate oversight of key facts. Even letters delivered by my assistant to address strategic missteps were returned unopened or shuffled aside with polite, dismissive explanations. "They will review and respond," Sophie told me, but her eyes betrayed the truth that response was unlikely. At our Chicago headquarters, documents appeared on my desk highlighting misaligned projects, with memos signed in ways that suggested full compliance, while in reality, critical decisions had been made without my consent. During a conference call, I asked directly, why was the project timeline altered without approval? The voice on the other end hesitated before replying. "We believed it was in the company's best interest at the time." I could hear the unspoken implication that deviation from Emily's guidance would have been risky. In every meeting, the chain of misinformation seemed endless. I tried arranging one-on-one discussions with David, hoping he would realize the ramifications of what had been allowed to occur. "Dad, we are just adjusting to the current market," he said, his tone even but cautious, avoiding eye contact. I countered with precise examples. "These adjustments contradict prior agreements and jeopardize ongoing contracts." But his reply was calm dismissal, as if data and facts could not outweigh perceived progress. Attempts to involve Linda for a more balanced perspective also faltered. She would intervene softly, suggesting alternative approaches, yet her efforts were repeatedly ignored or subtly overridden by Emily, whose influence now carried an authority that seemed impervious to correction. Even Sophie, ever diligent, admitted after delivering 3 consecutive letters and following up with emails that her communications were met with polite acknowledgments but no substantive action. The cumulative effect of these failures weighed heavily on me. Each day, I noticed subtle signs of disregard, memos misplaced, decisions logged without my knowledge, small but consistent alterations in meeting agendas, and whispers of agreement with Emily that contradicted prior instructions. It was a systematic pattern, a network of obedience and misdirection that created the illusion of competence and initiative while leaving me sidelined. I realized that the betrayal had extended beyond a single action or conversation. It had become embedded in the daily operations, the culture of deference, and the unquestioned acceptance of Emily's guidance. I spent hours alone in my office, staring out at the city skyline, feeling the isolation settle in, a slow but certain acknowledgement that the people I had trusted implicitly, from family members to seasoned executives, were caught in a web of manipulated perception that left me without allies. The emotional impact was profound. Each unanswered call, each ignored memo, each polite but empty response reinforced a creeping sense of detachment, of being unseen and unheard in my own company. And as I leaned back in my chair, I understood that the road ahead would require not just correction, but a profound recalibration of trust, influence, and authority. And yet, at that very moment, the feeling of isolation was absolute, as if the entire company and family had turned quietly, yet unmistakably, away from me. I spent the following weeks in a haze of quiet despair, walking through the halls of my company as if I were a visitor in my own life. Each familiar office, each framed photograph of past achievements, now seemed like a reminder of what had been slowly slipping away. The betrayal that had begun with subtle manipulations had grown into a pervasive isolation, leaving me feeling abandoned by those I had trusted most. Linda noticed the change in me one morning as we sat together in the quiet of our lake cabin in Wisconsin. "John, you have not been sleeping," she said gently, placing a hand over mine. I did not answer immediately, staring out at the mist rising from the water. "I know," I admitted softly. "I am not sure how to repair what has been lost." Even David avoided discussing matters directly with me, his presence accompanied by polite distance rather than engagement. Emails arrived, some signed by Emily, others by executives who now deferred to her subtly, each message polite on the surface but carrying undertones of exclusion. "We have handled the meeting follow-ups as discussed," read one from David, ignoring my instructions and interpretations, the words carefully chosen to maintain the illusion of compliance while continuing the pattern of disregard. Phone calls intended to clarify project outcomes often ended with vague affirmations that nothing had changed, though the alterations were evident in the reports I received. Sophie, my assistant, quietly confided during one of our routine check-ins. "They are all following the narrative Emily set, even without realizing it." The truth settled heavily on me, and I realized that the isolation was no longer just organizational. It was personal. I had lost the shared understanding with my son, the partnership I had once had with my daughter-in-law, and the active support of those around me who had once been allies. Nights at the cabin became long stretches of silence, the only sounds the occasional splash from the lake or the wind rattling the windows. Conversations with Linda were soft and measured, a contrast to the cacophony of distorted communication at the office. "Do you think he will understand?" she asked, referring to David. "I do not know," I admitted. "But I see now that understanding may not be the point. The point is acknowledgement, even if it is absent for now." The depth of my solitude brought a clarity I had not expected. I became painfully aware of the ways in which trust had been fractured, and how my attempts to intervene had been neutralized not by open confrontation, but by quiet, systematic diversion. Even small gestures of connection, an email acknowledging my input, a meeting scheduled with my consent, were absent, leaving me to reckon with the stark reality of emotional abandonment. Yet within this recognition, a faint glimmer emerged, an awareness that, while others had participated in deception and neglect, I still retained the ability to act with intentionality, to reclaim influence and integrity at my own pace. Linda squeezed my hand, a silent signal that she too recognized the shifting potential. I realized that the feelings of loss and isolation, as heavy as they were, had created a space for reflection and deliberate action. It was here, at this lowest point, that the seeds of recovery began to take root, suggesting that even in profound absence and betrayal, the possibility for restoration and meaningful intervention could emerge if approached with patience, clarity, and resolve. I stopped spending my energy trying to convince people to see what they refused to see. That was the first real change. One cold Monday morning, I drove into Chicago before sunrise and parked in the same corner spot I had used for years. The city was still waking up. Streetlights reflected off the wet pavement, and for the first time in months, I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. Clarity. Instead of chasing explanations, I started rebuilding. Quietly, deliberately. I began reviewing every department personally, not to control people, but to understand what was actually happening beneath the layers of assumptions and distractions. I met with employees who had been with the company for 20 and 30 years. People who rarely spoke in executive meetings. People whose names never appeared in headlines or company newsletters. One afternoon I sat down with Carl Henderson, a maintenance supervisor who had worked for me for 26 years. He looked surprised when I asked him to join me for lunch. "You really want my opinion?" he asked. "More than ever," I replied. Carl hesitated before speaking. A lot of people stopped sharing concerns because they felt nobody was listening anymore. His words stayed with me for days. Similar conversations followed. Warehouse managers, account coordinators, field technicians, project supervisors. The story was always slightly different, but the message was remarkably consistent. People wanted stability. They wanted honesty. They wanted leadership they could trust. Meanwhile, I spent evenings at the lake cabin with Linda, reviewing old notebooks filled with plans from the early years of the company. "You kept all of these?" I asked one night. She smiled. "I knew someday you would need reminding." Inside those notebooks were handwritten goals, sketches, budgets, and lessons learned through decades of hard work. Looking through them felt like reconnecting with a version of myself that had become buried beneath years of stress and compromise. One evening, Linda poured 2 cups of coffee and placed one beside me. "You seem different," she said. "I am." "How?" I stared at the lake outside the window. "I stopped trying to win arguments. Now I am focused on building something stronger." She nodded quietly. "That sounds like the man I married." Back at headquarters, I launched a small initiative designed to improve communication between departments. Nothing dramatic. No public announcements. No speeches. Just practical improvements. Weekly listening sessions. Anonymous employee feedback. Direct reporting channels. The response surprised even me. Participation grew quickly. Employees who had remained silent for years suddenly had a voice. New ideas emerged. Long-standing operational issues were identified and solved. Productivity improved. Morale improved. Most importantly, trust began returning. Sophie noticed it first. "People are talking differently around here," she said one afternoon while organizing reports. "What do you mean?" "They seem hopeful again." I smiled. Hope is underrated. Meanwhile, David remained distant. Our conversations became professional and brief. Emily appeared increasingly frustrated by changes she could not fully control. Yet I no longer felt compelled to react. I simply kept moving forward. Every day, I focused on actions rather than arguments. Results rather than appearances. Substance rather than noise. Then something unexpected happened. During a quarterly review meeting, one of our largest clients requested a private conversation with me. After the meeting ended, he closed the conference room door and sat across from me. "John," he said, sliding a folder across the table, "there is an opportunity coming, and before anyone else hears about it, I want you to see this." I opened the folder and immediately realized that what I was looking at had the potential to change not only the future of the company, but the balance of influence inside my family as well. And for the first time in a very long while, I could see a path toward a future none of them were expecting. I spent the next several weeks studying the opportunity that had landed on my desk. It was not just another contract. It was a large-scale infrastructure partnership involving multiple manufacturing facilities across the Midwest, the kind of project that could shape the direction of a company for years. What surprised me most was not the size of the opportunity, but the reason it had come directly to me. During our second meeting, the client looked across the conference table and said something I had not heard in a very long time. "John, we are here because of your reputation." Those words stayed with me, not because they fed my ego, but because they reminded me of something I had almost forgotten. Influence built slowly through integrity lasts longer than influence built through visibility. For years, I had allowed myself to become distracted by internal conflict. Now my attention returned to what had built the company in the first place: trust, consistency, and results. The project moved forward quickly. I assembled a team made up of experienced managers, field supervisors, and department leaders who had demonstrated reliability over many years. During one planning session, Carl Henderson pointed at a series of charts spread across the conference table. "We can complete Phase 1 6 weeks ahead of schedule if we coordinate directly with the regional suppliers." I smiled. "That is exactly why I wanted you in this room." The confidence around the table was different from anything I had seen in months. People were contributing, collaborating, taking ownership. There was no need for posturing, no need for political maneuvering, only the shared goal of doing excellent work. As the project gained momentum, something inside me changed as well. I stopped seeing myself as someone trying to regain lost ground. Instead, I began seeing myself as a leader building a stronger future. One morning, Sophie walked into my office carrying a package. "This arrived for you," she said. Inside was a custom engraved plaque from one of our oldest clients. The inscription read, "To John Miller, trusted leader, builder of people, builder of results." I stared at those words for several seconds. The plaque was simple: a polished walnut base, brushed steel lettering, nothing extravagant. Yet it meant more to me than many awards I had received over the years. I placed it on the corner of my desk where I could see it every morning. A few days later, another symbolic moment arrived. During a regional industry conference in Milwaukee, I was invited to deliver the keynote address. As I stepped onto the stage wearing the company name badge that had accompanied me through countless projects and decades of work, I felt something unexpected. Not pride, peace. The audience rose to their feet after the presentation. Several executives approached me afterward. One of them extended his hand and said, "John, your leadership style is becoming rare." People noticed that. Driving back to Chicago that evening, I realized how much my perspective had changed. Success no longer meant proving someone wrong. It meant becoming fully aligned with my values again. Linda noticed it immediately. One evening, she sat across from me at the lake cabin while we watched the sunset spread across the water. "You seem lighter," she said. I laughed softly. Maybe I finally stopped carrying things that were never mine to carry. She raised her coffee cup. "I think that is called wisdom." By early autumn, the project was exceeding expectations. Revenue projections were strong. Employee engagement was improving. Clients were expanding their commitments. The company was becoming healthier than it had been in years. Most importantly, I felt stronger than I had in a very long time. Not because circumstances were perfect, but because I trusted myself again. And as I sat in that boardroom in the present day, looking across the same table where so much tension had once existed, I realized every difficult step had brought me exactly to this moment, the moment when the truth was finally ready to be revealed. I returned my attention to the present and looked around the boardroom. The same room that had once felt hostile now felt very different. Not because the people had changed overnight, but because I had. The floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked downtown Chicago, and the late afternoon sunlight stretched across the polished walnut table. Nobody was speaking. The silence felt heavier than any argument. David sat across from me, his posture no longer filled with certainty. Emily remained composed on the surface, but I noticed the small signs of tension. Her fingers tapped lightly against a closed notebook. Her eyes shifted occasionally toward Michael Thompson, who sat quietly beside me. Linda remained calm, her expression unreadable. For the first time in a very long time, I was not reacting to the room. The room was reacting to me. That realization alone told me how much had changed. Michael organized several folders in front of him with deliberate precision. Sophie stood near the side wall, holding a tablet and a stack of documents. Several senior executives remained seated around the table, waiting. Nobody seemed eager to break the silence. Finally, David cleared his throat. "Dad, what exactly is the purpose of this meeting?" His voice sounded measured, but underneath I could hear concern. I folded my hands together. "Clarity." Emily leaned forward slightly. "Clarity about what?" I looked directly at her. "About decisions. About authority. About facts." Nobody interrupted. A year earlier, multiple people would have immediately jumped into the conversation. Now everyone waited. The shift in control was unmistakable. One of the board members adjusted his glasses and glanced toward Michael. Another executive opened a folder, then quietly closed it again without speaking. The atmosphere felt like the moments before a major storm arrives, when the air becomes still and everyone senses something important is coming. Michael finally spoke. Over the past several months, we have conducted a comprehensive review of governance procedures, internal communications, partnership recommendations, and executive decision pathways. His tone was calm and professional. Emily immediately responded, "Are we discussing future planning?" Michael smiled politely. Among other things. That answer seemed to make her even more uncomfortable. I watched David carefully. For the first time, he looked less like a confident executive and more like the young man I had raised. There was uncertainty in his eyes. Questions, doubt, perhaps even regret. The realization did not make me angry. It made me sad, because somewhere along the way, ambition had replaced perspective. Linda reached for her coffee cup. The simple movement seemed to remind everyone that she had been present through every chapter of the company's history. Every risk, every sacrifice, every difficult season. Yet for years, her contributions had been treated as background details rather than foundational truths. Sophie walked forward and placed several binders in front of each board member. Nobody opened them immediately. They simply stared at them. David looked toward me. "You have known about all of this for a while, have you not?" I nodded. "Long enough." Emily crossed her arms. "And you waited?" "Yes." "Why?" I paused for several seconds before answering. "Because facts become more powerful when people are ready to hear them." The room became completely silent again. Even the sounds from the city outside seemed distant. Somewhere below, traffic moved through the streets. Elevators traveled between floors. Phones rang in offices throughout the building. Yet inside that boardroom, time felt suspended. Michael slowly opened the folder in front of him. Several executives followed. Pages turned. Eyes widened. Sophie prepared a presentation on the screen. David stared at the first page and immediately sat back in his chair. Emily's expression changed the moment she recognized one particular document. I saw the exact second she understood what was about to happen. And just before Michael stood to present the evidence that would finally expose everything that had been hidden beneath months of assumptions, influence, and carefully managed appearances, the entire room fell into a silence so complete that nobody dared speak. Michael rose from his chair and walked calmly to the large screen at the front of the boardroom. Nobody spoke. The sound of the projector activating seemed unusually loud in the silence. One by one, documents appeared on the screen. Partnership evaluations, governance reviews, independent client assessments, executive performance analyses conducted by outside consulting firms. Everything had been verified by third parties. Everything had been documented. Everything was factual. Michael adjusted his glasses and began speaking in a measured tone. Over the past 12 months, several independent reviews have been conducted regarding leadership effectiveness, organizational trust, client retention, and strategic execution. He clicked to the next slide. Charts appeared. Numbers, metrics, client satisfaction scores, employee retention figures, revenue projections. Nobody interrupted. David stared at the screen. Emily sat perfectly still. "The findings reveal a clear pattern," Michael continued. "The highest performing divisions consistently demonstrated three common characteristics: stability, accountability, and direct alignment with the leadership principles established by the founder." Several executives exchanged glances. Michael advanced another slide. This time the screen displayed a series of client testimonials. One after another. Names, companies, years of partnership. The comments were remarkably similar. Trusted leadership, long-term vision, consistent integrity, dependable execution. I watched as the atmosphere in the room shifted. Not dramatically, quietly, inevitably. The truth was not arriving as an accusation. It was arriving as evidence. Emily finally spoke. "What exactly is this supposed to prove?" Her voice remained controlled, but the confidence behind it was fading. Michael nodded politely. "A fair question." He clicked again. A new document appeared. Then another. Then another. These were recent communications from major clients. Several had specifically requested my involvement in future projects. Some had even included language stating that their continued expansion depended upon maintaining leadership continuity. David leaned forward. "I have never seen those." "No," Michael replied. "You have not." The room became even quieter. I finally spoke. That is because many of these communications were directed specifically to me. David looked at me as if he were seeing me differently for the first time. Not as a father, not as an obstacle, not even as a founder, as a leader whose influence extended far beyond the walls of the company. Sophie distributed another set of documents around the table. Board members began reading immediately. One executive removed his glasses and reread a page. Another slowly shook his head. The information spoke for itself. Years of relationships, years of trust, years of credibility. None of it could be replicated overnight. Emily glanced down at the papers in front of her. Her expression changed as she reached the final section. For the first time since the meeting began, she seemed genuinely unsettled. These recommendations, she whispered. Michael nodded. Yes. She looked up. They came directly from the advisory committee? Unanimously. The advisory committee consisted of respected industry leaders from outside the company. People with no personal agendas, no family ties, no internal politics. Their conclusions carried tremendous weight. David slowly exhaled. I did not know any of this. I looked directly at him. That is part of the problem. He lowered his eyes. Nobody rushed to fill the silence. Nobody needed to. The facts were already doing the work. After several long moments, David finally looked back at me. There was no anger in his face anymore. No challenge. Only realization. I thought I understood the company, he said quietly. You understood part of it, I replied. But not all of it. Linda sat beside me with calm dignity. She said nothing. She did not need to. Her presence alone carried meaning. Years of sacrifice. Years of loyalty. Years of work that had often gone unnoticed. Emily looked around the room. The support she had expected was gone. Not because anyone had turned against her, but because reality had finally entered the conversation. Then Michael opened the final folder. Even before he spoke, I saw several board members straighten in their seats. David's eyes widened. Emily's face lost all color. And when the title page became visible across the screen, a wave of shock moved through the room so suddenly that nobody seemed capable of speaking. As the final slide appeared on the screen, the room seemed to hold its breath. The documents traced the chain of decisions over the past 18 months, each one stamped, signed, and time-stamped, revealing the origin of every recommendation, every manipulated suggestion, every misrepresented report. Michael looked around calmly. All these communications and adjustments originated from the advisory committee's verified assessments and directives, which were consistently shared with me and executed without deviation, he said. The board members shifted in their seats, reading the names, dates, and client references that confirmed what they had all suspected but could not prove. David's hands tightened around the edge of the table. I did not realize the extent of what had been coordinated, he admitted quietly, his voice almost lost in the thick tension. Emily's lips pressed into a thin line. Her confidence eroded as she traced each page with her eyes, seeing the facts she had underestimated. I leaned forward slightly, resting my hands on the table, my voice steady and deliberate. The chain of responsibility is clear. Decisions that were made without acknowledgement of actual contributions have been identified and will be corrected according to these verified assessments. Linda, sitting beside me, placed a hand lightly on my arm, a subtle show of support that reinforced the gravity of the moment. One of the senior executives adjusted his glasses and spoke. John, this clarifies so much. We were unaware of the origin and intent behind the changes. I nodded calmly. That is why it is essential to understand the source of all guidance before making assumptions. The room was quiet, yet the atmosphere was electric with awareness. Every eye now looked at me differently, recognizing not only the leadership I had demonstrated over decades, but the discernment that had guided my actions even when I had been marginalized. David looked at me, a mixture of awe and humility in his expression. I thought I was leading effectively, he said softly. You were executing what was presented to you, but you were not seeing the full picture, I replied evenly. Emily swallowed. Her confidence diminished but composed. So everything we believed was correct was incomplete? She asked. I nodded. Correct. Facts matter more than appearances. Michael closed the last folder and turned toward the team. Moving forward, protocols will be adjusted to ensure clarity, proper acknowledgement, and alignment with verified leadership principles. I added, and I expect transparency in every decision that affects the company, no exceptions. David exhaled slowly. I understand. Emily looked down at her notes, then back at me. We will follow the updated protocols. The room settled into a quiet acknowledgement. The truth had been exposed, the hierarchy clarified, and control shifted back to its rightful place. Yet as I observed the subdued expressions of my son, daughter-in-law, and the executives, I recognized that understanding had only begun. Relationships would need to rebuild. Trust would need time. I was calm, but my gaze held an unspoken boundary. Accountability would now be non-negotiable. The air was thick with tension, but there was also the sense of relief that clarity brought. I realized that the impact of this revelation was profound, yet the emotional threads were far from fully resolved. There remained uncertainty about how past mistakes would affect future collaboration, and while the power balance had been restored, the full measure of change would unfold slowly over weeks, months, and perhaps years. The room sat silently, each person absorbing the gravity of the facts, each person beginning to understand that the way forward would require diligence, patience, and unwavering recognition of truth. And as I leaned back slightly, I felt the first cautious stirrings of order returning even while the echoes of past betrayal lingered just beneath the surface. The months that followed were not perfect, but they were honest. And after everything that had happened, honesty felt like a greater gift than comfort. The company became stronger because decisions were once again grounded in transparency and accountability. Teams communicated more openly. Clients renewed long-term agreements. Projects moved forward with renewed confidence. More importantly, the tension that had once dominated every room slowly gave way to something healthier: clarity. David changed as well. Not overnight. Real growth rarely happens that way. There were difficult conversations, long silences, moments of reflection. But over time, he began asking questions instead of making assumptions. He listened more. He observed more. One afternoon, several months after the board meeting, he walked into my office carrying 2 cups of coffee. He sat across from me and stared out the window for a few seconds before speaking. I spent so much time trying to prove I was ready that I stopped paying attention to the people who helped me get here. I looked at him quietly. That happens to more people than you think. He nodded. I wish I had understood that sooner. Emily changed too. She became more thoughtful, more deliberate, and less concerned with appearances. She focused on contributing rather than influencing. Trust was not restored instantly, but small actions accumulated. Consistency replaced assumptions. Responsibility replaced entitlement. And slowly, relationships began healing. Linda remained exactly who she had always been: steady, wise, and quietly strong. Looking back, I realized she had seen the truth long before I did. Not because she was suspicious, but because she understood something I had forgotten. Love does not mean ignoring reality. Love sometimes means facing reality with courage. These days, life feels simpler. I spend more time at the lake cabin in Wisconsin. I take early morning walks along the shoreline. I read more books. I drink coffee on the porch with Linda while watching the sun rise over the water. The company still matters to me, but it no longer defines me. That may be the greatest lesson I learned through all of this. There was a time when I believed my value came from my position, my achievements, or the respect of others. I know better now. Your value does not disappear because someone fails to recognize it. Your worth does not decrease because others misunderstand your contribution. And your identity should never depend entirely on another person's approval. If this story has taught me anything, it is that healthy boundaries are not acts of rejection. They are acts of self-respect. Protect your finances. Protect your emotional well-being. Document important decisions. Trust actions more than promises. And most importantly, do not abandon yourself while trying to keep peace with everyone else. Sometimes the people closest to us will disappoint us. Sometimes trust will be tested. Sometimes life will force us to confront painful truths we never wanted to see. But I also believe that God gives us quiet moments of clarity if we are willing to listen. Often, the answer arrives not through conflict, but through stillness. If you are listening to my voice right now and carrying your own burden, perhaps from family, relationships, business, or disappointment, I want you to know something. You are not alone. You are not defined by someone else's opinion of you. You are not required to shrink yourself so others can feel comfortable. Healing takes time. Growth takes courage. But both are possible. Thank you for spending this time with me, and allowing me to share this chapter of my life. Stories connect us because they remind us that pain is universal, but so is resilience. My name is John Miller. I am 68 years old, and the core lesson I want to leave with you is simple. Never allow anyone else to define your value when you already know who you are. As I finish this story, I am sitting on the old wooden dock behind our lake cabin. Beside me rests the small walnut plaque that once sat on my office desk. The evening sun reflects across the water. The wind moves gently through the trees. Linda is waiting on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. And as I look at that plaque one final time before heading inside, I realize that the strongest foundations are not built from power, money, or recognition. They are built from truth. If this story touched your heart, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments. Tell us where you are listening from, and subscribe if you would like to hear more stories like this. There are many more journeys waiting ahead, each carrying its own lessons, challenges, and moments of hope. Somewhere in the next story may be a lesson you need exactly when you need it. And sometimes the story we choose to listen to next becomes the one that changes how we see our own lives. Because in the end, the people who find peace are often not the ones who win every battle, but the ones who never lose themselves along the way.